If you ever feel your instincts begging you to run, don't ignore them, because the night I asked a stranger for help was the night my entire life changed. My name is Emily Carter, and until that Thursday night, I believed danger always looked obvious. I thought it announced itself with sirens, broken windows, or people shouting in the street. I was wrong. Sometimes danger simply walks 20 feet behind you, matching your pace one quiet step at a time. My shift at Hargrove Books ended at 9:47 p.m., almost an hour later than usual, because inventory always seemed to stretch longer than anyone expected. The store sat on the edge of Midtown Manhattan, where office towers slowly emptied after sunset and the sidewalks transformed from crowded rivers of commuters into scattered islands of strangers hurrying home. I wrapped my gray scarf tighter around my neck as cold November rain drifted through the city, turning every streetlight into a blurry golden halo. My apartment was only 6 blocks away. Normally, I enjoyed the walk. It gave me time to clear my head before another morning of classes and another afternoon shelving books. I had spent the last 3 years balancing community college with 2 jobs, telling myself that every exhausting day moved me one step closer to becoming a librarian. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I adjusted the worn canvas bag hanging from my shoulder and stepped onto Lexington Avenue. The first few blocks felt completely ordinary. A couple laughed outside a pizza shop. A taxi splashed through a puddle. Somewhere above me, a train rumbled across elevated tracks, its distant vibration blending into the heartbeat of the city. Then I noticed him. At first, it was nothing more than a reflection in a dark storefront window. A man wearing a navy jacket had turned onto the same sidewalk I had. That wasn't unusual. Hundreds of people walked these streets every night. I kept going without another thought. 2 minutes later, I stopped outside a pharmacy to check my phone. My roommate had texted asking if I could pick up milk in the morning. While I answered, I caught another glimpse of the same navy jacket standing across the intersection. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was simply waiting. The traffic light changed. I crossed. So did he. A nervous flutter settled somewhere beneath my ribs. Don't be ridiculous, Emily, I told myself. People walk in the same direction all the time. I turned left instead of right, taking a route I almost never used. The sidewalk became quieter. Most businesses had already locked their doors, leaving only reflections of empty offices behind polished glass. Rain tapped softly against awnings overhead while my sneakers splashed through shallow puddles. 30 seconds later, I glanced behind me again. The navy jacket had turned left too. My breathing slowed without permission. I could hear my own footsteps. Then I realized I could hear another pair following the exact same rhythm. Step, 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 pause, step. I told myself not to panic. Maybe he lived nearby. Maybe he was just another tired New Yorker trying to get home before the rain became heavier. But something inside me refused to believe that explanation. I crossed another street without waiting for the signal. A delivery truck honked somewhere behind me. When I reached the opposite sidewalk, I looked back. He had crossed too. The distance between us was smaller now. Maybe 40 feet. Close enough that I could make out the outline of his face beneath the hood of his jacket, though not clearly enough to recognize his expression. My heartbeat became loud enough to drown out the city. I slipped my phone into my coat pocket instead of holding it in my hand. I didn't want him to think I was distracted. Every self-defense article I'd ever read rushed through my mind all at once. Stay in well-lit areas. Trust your instincts. Find other people. Don't lead someone to your home. I changed directions again, heading toward Park Avenue where traffic usually stayed busy even late at night. The rain picked up, tiny drops collecting along my eyelashes until the lights ahead blurred together into streaks of white and gold. Then, through the curtain of rain, I saw a long black SUV stopped at a red light. It looked impossibly polished despite the weather, its windows dark enough to hide whoever sat. Inside, I barely noticed the expensive wheels or the suited driver behind the windshield because at that exact moment I heard footsteps moving faster behind me. I didn't look back this time. Every instinct I had screamed the same 2 words. Run now. My legs moved before my mind could catch up. The rain soaked through my coat as I rushed toward the black SUV, my shoes slipping slightly against the wet pavement. The traffic light above the intersection glowed red, trapping the vehicle exactly where I needed it to be. I reached the passenger side and knocked on the tinted window harder than I intended. My hand trembled so badly that the second knock sounded louder than the first. For one terrifying second, nothing happened. I wondered if I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. Then the rear window began to slide down with smooth mechanical precision. Warm air drifted out, carrying the faint scent of expensive leather and cedar. I found myself staring into a pair of calm gray eyes. The man inside looked to be in his mid-30s, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit without a single wrinkle despite the miserable weather outside. Dark hair framed a face that seemed carved from stone, composed, unreadable, almost impossibly still. He did not appear surprised that a soaked stranger had interrupted his evening. He simply looked at me as though he expected me to speak first. I realized I was breathing far too fast. My words stumbled over each other before I finally forced them out. Please, I think that man is following me. My voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. I hated how frightened I sounded, but I could not hide it anymore. His expression did not change. Instead, his eyes lifted over my shoulder for the briefest moment. Is he still behind you? He asked quietly. I swallowed and nodded without turning around. Somehow, I knew that if I looked back, my fear would become real. The man gave one slow glance toward the driver seated in front. No words were exchanged. The driver simply unlocked the doors with the touch of a button. Before I could react, the man inside stepped out into the rain. He was taller than I expected, easily 6'3", and carried himself with effortless confidence. Not arrogance. Something quieter. The kind of confidence that did not need to announce itself because everyone else already recognized it. He closed the door behind him and stood beside me beneath the falling rain as though the weather did not exist. Stay here, he said. The words were calm, almost gentle, yet somehow impossible to ignore. I obeyed without thinking. Only then did I finally glance behind me. The man in the navy jacket had stopped about 30 feet away. Under the streetlights, I could see him more clearly now. He looked ordinary. Average height. Baseball cap pulled low. Hands inside his pockets. For a moment he hesitated, clearly surprised that I was no longer alone. Then he started walking again. My pulse climbed into my throat. The stranger beside me remained perfectly still. He waited until the man had come within several yards before speaking. Can I help you? His voice never rose above a normal conversation. The other man slowed his pace. No problem, he replied with an awkward laugh. I am just walking. So are we, the stranger answered. Silence settled over the sidewalk. Passing cars rolled through the intersection, their headlights reflecting across the wet asphalt. Somewhere nearby, someone closed the gate of a restaurant with a metallic clang. The city continued moving while the space around us felt strangely frozen. The man in the navy jacket shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His eyes briefly moved past the stranger and landed on me. I instinctively stepped half a pace backward. The stranger noticed. I could tell without looking at him because his posture changed almost imperceptibly. Not aggressive. Protective. As though he had quietly placed himself between me and everything else. The driver had already stepped out of the SUV. So had another man from the front passenger seat. Both wore dark suits. Neither spoke. Neither looked nervous. They simply stood nearby with the alert calmness of people who had handled unexpected situations many times before. Something about them transformed the atmosphere completely. The man in the navy jacket looked from one face to another, and whatever confidence he had carried down the sidewalk slowly disappeared. He forced another smile that never reached his eyes. Wrong person, he muttered. I thought she was somebody else. The stranger held his gaze for another second before giving a small nod. Then I believe your evening is taking you somewhere else. There was no thread in his words. No raised voice. Nothing dramatic. Yet the man immediately turned around and walked away without another sentence. I watched him disappear into the rain until he vanished beyond the glow of the next intersection. Only after he was gone did I realize I had been holding my breath. I let out a shaky exhale and wrapped my arms around myself, trying to stop trembling. Thank you, I whispered. I do not know what would have happened if. My sentence faded because the stranger was no longer watching the empty sidewalk. His eyes were fixed farther down the block, his expression unchanged but somehow more focused than before. After several silent seconds, he finally spoke. This is not over. He was never alone. I stared at him, trying to understand what he meant. The man who had followed me was gone. I had watched him disappear into the rain with my own eyes. Every logical part of my mind wanted to believe the nightmare had ended right there on that sidewalk. What do you mean he was not alone? I asked quietly. The stranger did not answer immediately. His attention remained fixed on the opposite side of the street, where several parked cars lined the curb beneath dim streetlights. To me, they looked ordinary. Sedans. Delivery vans. A yellow taxi waiting for a passenger. Nothing seemed unusual. But the longer he watched, the more I realized he was not looking at the vehicles. He was watching the spaces between them. He noticed details I could not even see. Finally, he looked at me again. What is your name? Emily. Emily Carter. He nodded once. Emily, I need you to answer one question honestly. Has anyone else made you uncomfortable this week? Anyone who appeared more than once? I opened my mouth to say no. Then I hesitated. There had been little things. Things I had dismissed because life in New York taught you not to overthink every stranger you passed. 2 days earlier, I remembered seeing the same dark sedan parked across from the bookstore when my shift ended. Yesterday morning, I had noticed someone sitting inside it while I unlocked the front door. At the time, I assumed it belonged to someone working nearby. Now those memories returned with uncomfortable clarity. Maybe, I admitted. I thought it was nothing. His expression remained perfectly calm, but something behind his eyes sharpened. Most people do. The driver approached quietly. Mr. Romano. It was the first time I heard the stranger's name. Romano. The driver leaned close enough that only he could hear whatever was being said. I caught only 2 words. Same vehicle. Adrian Romano gave the slightest nod. Keep watching. The driver stepped away without another question. My heartbeat began climbing again. Who are you? I asked before I could stop myself. For the first time that evening, something almost resembling a smile touched his face. It lasted less than a second. Someone who prefers quiet evenings. I almost laughed despite everything. It was such an absurd answer that it caught me completely off guard. Before I could ask another question, headlights appeared at the far end of the block. A black luxury sedan rolled slowly toward the intersection before stopping across the street. The windows were dark enough that I could not see inside. It remained there without moving. Adrian noticed it immediately. So did the 2 men standing beside the SUV. None of them appeared surprised. They simply watched. The traffic light changed from red to green, but the sedan did not continue. It waited. 30 seconds passed. Then 45. Every instinct inside me whispered that something was wrong. Why is it just sitting there? I asked. Adrian answered without taking his eyes off the vehicle. Because they are deciding whether to continue. My stomach tightened. He finally looked at me. Emily, you asked me for help. I intend to make certain you get home safely. But I need you to trust me for the next few minutes. I wanted to ask why. I wanted to ask how he seemed to know exactly what was happening. Instead, I simply nodded. Something about the certainty in his voice made arguing feel pointless. He opened the rear passenger door of the SUV. Please get inside. I hesitated. Every lesson my parents had taught me flashed through my mind. Do not get into a stranger's car. Do not trust someone you just met. Yet those lessons had never included what to do when the stranger standing beside you felt infinitely safer than the city surrounding you. I climbed inside. The interior was warm and impossibly quiet, shutting out the rain and traffic almost completely. Adrian took the seat across from me instead of beside me, leaving respectful distance between us. The door closed softly. Through the tinted window, I watched the black sedan across the street. Another minute passed before it slowly pulled away, disappearing into traffic without ever crossing the intersection. Only then did Adrian release a slow breath. Good, he said. They decided tonight was not worth the risk. I stared at him in disbelief. Who are they? He folded his hands calmly, studying me with the same unreadable expression he had worn since the moment I knocked on his window. That, he replied quietly, is exactly what I intend to find out before anyone gets close to you again. The silence inside the SUV felt different from any silence I had ever experienced. It was not awkward. It was not empty. It was the kind of silence that made every tiny sound seem important. The soft hum of the engine, raindrops tapping against the roof, the faint ticking of an expensive watch somewhere beneath Adrian Romano's sleeve. I realized I was still clutching the strap of my canvas bag so tightly that my fingers had started to ache. I slowly loosened my grip, embarrassed by how obvious my fear must have been. Adrian noticed anyway. You are safe for the moment, he said in the same calm voice that never seemed to change. Try to breathe normally. I looked out the window at the city sliding past us. The SUV had pulled away from the intersection without me even noticing. Manhattan continued exactly as it always had. Restaurants glowed with warm lights. Couples hurried beneath shared umbrellas. Delivery. Cyclists weaved through traffic as if the rain did not exist. It was strange how ordinary everything looked while my entire world had quietly shifted in less than 15 minutes. "Where are we going?" I finally asked. "Your apartment." His answer surprised me. "You know where I live?" "Not yet." Another almost smile appeared for a brief moment. "You are going to tell my driver." There was no arrogance in his tone. He simply spoke as though every problem had a practical solution waiting to be found. I gave the driver my address. He acknowledged it with a polite nod before focusing on the road again. No unnecessary conversation. No curious questions. The professionalism inside this vehicle felt almost unreal. After several blocks, Adrian reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a slim black phone. He tapped the screen once before placing it beside him without saying a word. Less than 10 seconds later, his own phone rang. He answered immediately. "Report." He listened far more than he spoke. His face revealed nothing, but I watched the rhythm of the conversation through tiny details. A slight narrowing of his eyes. One finger tapping lightly against the leather seat. Then a single question. "How long?" A pause followed. "Continue observing. Do not approach anyone unless necessary." The call ended. He placed the phone back into his pocket as though nothing unusual had happened. I could not stop myself anymore. Is someone investigating the man who followed me? He turned toward me. Someone is trying to understand why he chose you. Maybe there is nothing to understand. Maybe I was simply in the wrong place. Adrian shook his head once. Fear creates patterns. Experience teaches you to notice them. I frowned. You make it sound like this happens all the time. He looked out the rain-covered window instead of answering immediately. To people who are paying attention, yes. His words lingered in my mind. I thought back over the past month, replaying ordinary moments that suddenly felt different. The dark sedan near the bookstore. A stranger lingering inside the coffee shop longer than everyone else. Someone standing across the street while pretending to read a newspaper. Had those things really happened, or was my frightened mind rewriting old memories into something they had never been? I honestly did not know anymore. 20 minutes later, the SUV slowed as we entered my neighborhood. The apartment buildings were older here, built long before glass towers transformed the skyline. The sidewalks were quieter, lined with bare trees whose branches swayed gently in the cold wind. My building appeared ahead, its brick walls glowing beneath yellow entrance lights. Normally seeing home filled me with relief. Tonight, it only filled me with uncertainty. The SUV stopped across the street instead of directly in front of the entrance. Adrian looked through the windshield without speaking. The driver remained completely still, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. Another suited man quietly stepped out of the front passenger seat and disappeared into the rain. I watched him cross the street and walk casually past my building as though he were simply another resident returning home. 5 minutes passed. Neither Adrian nor the driver said a single word. Finally, the man returned and leaned toward Adrian's open window. Everything appears normal. Adrian thanked him with a nod. Only then did he open his door and step into the rain. I followed. Cold air immediately wrapped around me again. We stood beneath the glow of a street lamp while rain whispered against the pavement around us. I turned toward him with more questions than answers. "I still do not understand why you helped me." He studied my face for several quiet seconds before replying. "Because you asked." I blinked. "That cannot be the only reason." His eyes held mine steadily. "Most people spend their entire lives hoping someone powerful will notice they need help. Tonight you did not ask for power. You asked for safety." His words settled somewhere deep inside me. Before I could respond, he reached into his jacket and handed me a simple white business card. There was only one name, one phone number, and nothing else. "If anything feels wrong," he said, "do not convince yourself that you are imagining it. Call me first." I looked down at the card, then back at him. But by the time I found the right words, his driver had quietly opened the SUV door again. And I had the unmistakable feeling that meeting Adrian Romano had only been the beginning of a story neither of us had expected to live. I stood in the lobby long after the black SUV disappeared around the corner. The white business card rested in my hand, already damp from the rain that had followed me inside. Adrian Romano. One name, one phone number, no company logo, no title, nothing that explained why a man surrounded by drivers, security, and quiet authority had stopped his evening for a complete stranger. The elevator creaked as it carried me to the fourth floor. Every familiar sound inside my apartment building suddenly felt unfamiliar. The buzzing fluorescent light above the hallway. The old radiator clicking somewhere behind the walls. Mrs. Donnelly's television playing too loudly through her door at the end of the hall. Usually those little noises made the building feel alive. Tonight they made me wonder who else might be listening. I unlocked apartment 4B and stepped inside. Emily, my roommate, Sarah Mitchell, called from the kitchen. Relief washed over her face the second she saw me. Thank goodness. I was about to call you. You never answered my last text. I forced a smile while hanging my soaked coat by the door. I lost track of time. It was technically true, although it felt like several days had passed instead of 40 minutes. Sarah walked closer, stopping just short of me. She tilted her head. You look pale. Are you okay? I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to explain the footsteps behind me, the stranger in the SUV, the feeling that someone had been watching me for days. But the words refused to come. Saying them out loud would make the entire night real. Just a rough walk home, I replied. She accepted the answer more easily than I expected. There is soup on the stove if you want some. I thanked her, but my appetite had completely disappeared. Instead, I walked into my bedroom, locked the door out of habit, and sat on the edge of my bed. My phone showed 10:38 p.m. 3 missed notifications from classmates. Email about next week's history assignment. Nothing unusual. Nothing that suggested the world outside had quietly changed. Then my eyes landed on the white business card still resting in my hand. I placed it carefully inside my nightstand drawer, closed it, then opened it again almost immediately. Somehow hiding it made me more anxious than seeing it. Around midnight, after convincing myself I was finally calm enough to sleep, I switched off the bedside lamp. The room fell into darkness except for the orange glow of city lights filtering through the curtains. I closed my eyes. 5 minutes later, my phone vibrated. My heart jumped so violently that I almost dropped it. Unknown number. I stared at the screen until the vibration stopped. No voicemail. No message. I let out a slow breath, telling myself it was probably spam. Then the phone vibrated again. The same unknown number. This time a text message appeared. Are you home safely? I frowned. There was no signature. Nothing to identify the sender. Yet somehow I already knew. I typed a short reply before I could overthink it. Yes. Thank you again. Almost immediately another message appeared. Good. Lock your windows tonight. Sleep if you can. Tomorrow will be clearer. I stared at the words for several seconds. There was something oddly reassuring about how simple they were. No unnecessary drama. No attempt to impress me. Just practical advice from someone who sounded completely certain. I walked across the apartment, checking every window twice before closing the curtains tightly. Only then did I realize I had followed his instructions without questioning them. The next morning arrived with bright sunlight pouring through the gaps in the curtains, making the previous night almost feel imaginary. I showered, dressed, grabbed my backpack, and headed toward the bookstore before class. The city looked completely different beneath a clear blue sky. Office workers filled the sidewalks again. Street musicians played jazz outside the subway entrance. Children laughed while chasing pigeons through the small plaza near the library. I almost convinced myself everything had returned to normal. Then I reached Hargrove Books. My manager, Mr. Jenkins, stood outside the front entrance talking to a uniformed delivery driver. The moment he saw me, his eyebrows lifted. Emily, did you leave something outside last night? No. What? He pointed toward the large display window. Resting neatly against the brick wall was a brand new flower pot, filled with white lilies. A small envelope sat beside it with my name written across the front in elegant handwriting. My stomach tightened. I slowly picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single folded card containing only one sentence. Some people send flowers after danger has passed. I prefer making certain you remember that someone is still watching over you. There was no signature. None was necessary. I looked instinctively across the street. Hundreds of strangers moved through the morning crowd, each busy with their own lives. Yet for the first time, I no longer wondered whether Adrian Romano had kept his promise. I wondered how many times he had already protected me without my ever realizing he was there. For the rest of the morning, I could not stop thinking about the flowers. Customers came and went, asking for mystery novels, children's books, and travel guides, but every time the front door opened, my eyes drifted toward the sidewalk outside. The white lilies remained exactly where Mr. Jenkins had placed them near the register, filling the bookstore with a faint, clean fragrance that somehow made everything feel calmer. Around noon, my manager smiled as he watered them with an old glass pitcher. "Whoever sent these has excellent taste," he said. "I hope they are trying to impress you." I forced a quiet laugh. I do not think that is what they are trying to do. The truth was far more confusing. Adrian Romano had not flirted with me. He had not asked for dinner, my number, or even another meeting. Everything he had done seemed focused on one simple purpose: making sure I felt safe. That should have made me grateful. Instead, it made me curious. During my lunch break, I carried my sandwich to Bryant Park, hoping the fresh air would help organize my thoughts. The city buzzed with its usual weekday energy. Office workers filled every bench. Students hurried across the lawn carrying backpacks heavier than mine. A street musician played soft piano melodies beneath the trees. Looking around, it became almost impossible to believe that only 12 hours earlier I had been convinced someone was following me through rain-soaked streets. I reached into my pocket and found myself touching the business card without even realizing it. My phone vibrated before I could put it away. It was Sarah. "Please tell me you are actually eating lunch today," she joked. "I am trying," I answered. Trying means no. I smiled for the first time that day. "Fine. I am eating." We talked for several minutes about ordinary things. Rent, homework, her upcoming nursing exam. By the time the call ended, my breathing had finally slowed. Ordinary conversations had a way of reminding me that normal life still existed. As I stood to return to work, I noticed a small boy struggling to lift a cardboard box nearly half his size near the edge of the park. He could not have been older than 8. The box slipped from his hands, scattering canned food across the sidewalk. Without thinking, I hurried over to help him gather everything before anyone stepped on it. "Thank you," he said shyly. "These are for the shelter." An older volunteer approached moments later, smiling warmly. "We appreciate the help." I handed her the last can before preparing to leave. Then something caught my attention. Parked beside the shelter entrance was a familiar black SUV. My heartbeat skipped. The polished body reflected the afternoon sunlight exactly the way it had reflected the rain the previous night. The same driver stood nearby, speaking with several volunteers while quietly helping unload dozens of grocery boxes from the back of the vehicle. There were no photographers, no reporters, no banners announcing a donation. Just people working together as though they had done it many times before. Before I could decide whether to walk away, the rear passenger door opened. Adrian stepped out wearing a navy overcoat instead of yesterday's charcoal suit. He carried 2 large boxes himself, ignoring the volunteers who immediately offered to help. An elderly woman with silver hair greeted him with a smile that looked completely genuine. "You came yourself again," she said. Adrian returned the smile, softer than I had imagined possible. "I promised I would. The children have been asking about you all week." Then I should not disappoint them. I remained frozen several yards away, watching a version of him that no newspaper headline could have prepared me for. There was no cold authority, no intimidating presence. He knelt beside the little boy I had just helped, asking about school with patient interest while handing him a new backpack from one of the boxes. The child's face lit up with pure excitement. Adrian listened far more than he spoke, giving the boy his full attention as though there were nothing else in the world demanding his time. I must have stared longer than I realized because his eyes eventually lifted and met mine across the sidewalk. For one brief second, surprise crossed his face before settling back into quiet composure. He excused himself from the volunteers and walked toward me at an unhurried pace. "Emily," he said, "I was not expecting to see you here." "Neither was I admitted honestly. I glanced toward the shelter behind him. "You do this often?" He looked over his shoulder as children carried books and food inside the building. "Every Wednesday. No cameras." He gave a small shrug. Hunger does not become less serious when nobody is watching. His answer stayed with me longer than anything else he had said since we met. For the first time, I began wondering if the stories people whispered about Adrian Romano had left out the most important parts of the man standing in front of me. I returned to the bookstore that afternoon with more questions than answers. Every customer smiled, browsed the shelves, and continued with their day. completely unaware that only a few blocks away I had just witnessed a side of Adrian Romano that did not fit the image my imagination had created. I kept replaying the way the children had run toward him without fear, the way the volunteers greeted him by his first name, and the quiet sincerity in his voice when he spoke about keeping promises. By closing time, I had almost convinced myself that whatever had happened 2 nights earlier belonged in the past. The rain had disappeared, replaced by a crisp autumn evening, painted with orange light reflecting from glass buildings. Mr. Jenkins waved goodbye as I locked the bookstore door behind me. "See you tomorrow, Emily." "See you tomorrow." I adjusted my backpack and started toward the subway station instead of walking home. The streets were busier than they had been the previous night, and that made me feel a little foolish for still checking every reflection in every storefront window. Nothing looked unusual. Office workers hurried toward the trains. Food carts filled the air with the smell of roasted nuts and fresh pretzels. A violinist performed near the entrance to the station, while several tourists stopped to record videos. For the first 10 minutes, everything felt completely normal. Then my phone vibrated. One new message. Unknown number. I already knew who it was before opening it. Change direction. Do not enter the subway. My steps stopped instantly. My eyes moved across the crowd without drawing attention to myself. I typed as casually as I could. Why? The reply arrived almost immediately. Because someone entered the station 2 minutes ago and has not taken their eyes off you once. A chill ran through my entire body. I resisted every instinct telling me to look around. Instead, I continued walking as though I had simply changed my mind about taking the train. My heartbeat became louder with every step. Another message appeared. Walk toward the coffee shop on the next corner. Do not run. I obeyed without hesitation. The warm lights of the cafe came into view ahead, filled with students working on laptops and couples talking over steaming mugs. The moment I stepped inside, I finally allowed myself to breathe. I ordered the first drink that came to mind, even though I did not really want coffee. My hands shook just enough that I almost dropped my credit card. While waiting, I looked through the front window. Across the street stood a man pretending to study the menu posted outside a restaurant. He never entered. He never ordered. Every few seconds his attention drifted toward the coffee shop. My stomach tightened. Had he been there all along, or had Adrian noticed him before I ever could? The chair across from me slid backward. I looked up in surprise. Adrian sat down as though we had planned to meet all afternoon. He had exchanged his overcoat for a simple black jacket that somehow made him blend into the crowd despite being impossible to overlook. "You followed me?" I asked quietly. He shook his head. "No. I asked someone to watch over the area after your shift ended." I stared at him. "You have been doing that every day?" He met my eyes without hesitation. "Yes." I should have been angry. I should have told him that following someone without permission crossed every reasonable boundary. Instead, I remembered the man outside pretending to read the menu. "You knew before I did," I whispered. Adrian folded his hands calmly on the table. "That is the point." I looked back toward the window. The man had already disappeared into the evening crowd. "Who are these people?" I asked again. This time Adrian did not avoid the question. "They are organized." His voice remained steady. "The man who approached you 2 nights ago was only testing whether you were alone. Someone else has been observing your routine for several days." My mouth went dry. "But why me? I work in a bookstore. I go to class. I pay rent late almost every month. There is nothing special about me." Adrian studied my face for several quiet seconds before speaking again. "Emily, sometimes people are not interested in who you are." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes they are interested in something you saw without realizing it." My mind raced backward through dozens of ordinary days. Shelving books, walking home, buying coffee, crossing busy intersections. None of it made sense. Then one memory surfaced unexpectedly. 3 evenings before the man followed me, I had accidentally picked up a notebook someone had dropped outside the bookstore. I had called after him, but he disappeared into traffic before hearing me. The notebook had been collected minutes later by another well-dressed stranger who thanked me politely before leaving. At the time, it had seemed completely insignificant. Looking back now, I could still remember Adrian's expression changing the instant I mentioned it. It was the first time since we met that genuine concern appeared in his eyes. I could not stop staring at Adrian. The noise of the coffee shop faded until all I could hear was my own breathing. The memory seemed so ordinary that I had almost forgotten it completely. It was just a notebook, I said quietly. Someone dropped it outside the bookstore. I picked it up because I thought they would want it back. Adrian leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. Describe it. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to remember every detail. Dark blue leather. It looked expensive. No name on the cover. I only held it for maybe 20 seconds before another man came running over and thanked me. He said it belonged to his employer. Adrian remained silent. He seemed normal. I continued. Well-dressed. Polite. He even apologized for the inconvenience. Did he tell you his employer's name? No. Adrian nodded once, almost as though he had expected that answer. Did you open the notebook? I immediately shook my head. Of course not. He studied my face carefully, searching for any sign that I might be hiding something. Apparently satisfied, he folded his hands together. Then this became a problem because someone else believed you might have. I frowned. You think they assumed I read whatever was inside? I think they could not afford to take that chance. My stomach tightened, all because I picked something up from the sidewalk. Adrian looked toward the rain-speckled window before answering. People who protect valuable information often make decisions based on uncertainty rather than facts. I sat there trying to process the absurdity of it all. One small act of kindness. 20 seconds of holding a stranger's notebook. That was enough to change the direction of my life. I wish I had just kept walking, I whispered. Adrian looked back at me immediately. Do not say that. There was unexpected firmness in his voice. Helping someone was not your mistake. I lowered my eyes to the untouched cup of coffee between my hands. Then why does it feel like one? He remained quiet for several seconds before answering. Because good people often blame themselves for problems they did not create. His words settled somewhere deep inside me. They reminded me of the children at the shelter, the flowers outside the bookstore, the quiet way he had stepped between me and danger without asking for recognition. None of those actions matched the ruthless image I had imagined when I first saw the black SUV. Can I ask you something? I said softly. You already have. Another faint smile crossed his face. Why do you keep helping me? This time he did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked beyond the cafe window where people hurried through the evening carrying shopping bags and umbrellas. The city continued moving around us, completely unaware of the conversation taking place inside. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. Because someone once asked for help, and I arrived too late. I looked at him without interrupting. She was my older sister, he continued. I was 19. She called me while driving home one winter evening. She said someone had been following her for several miles. His eyes remained fixed on the street outside. I told her to stay on the phone. I told her I was coming. He paused. Traffic was heavier than usual. By the time I reached her, another family had already stopped to help. She was physically unharmed, but she told me something that stayed with me. His gaze finally returned to mine. She said the longest 5 minutes of her life were the 5 minutes she believed nobody was coming. I felt my chest tighten. After that night, Adrian said, I made myself one promise. If someone ever asked me for help again, they would never wonder whether anyone was coming. Neither of us spoke for several moments. I realized then that his promise had nothing to do with power or reputation. It came from regret. Quiet, deeply personal regret that had shaped the man sitting across from me. My phone suddenly buzzed on the table. The unfamiliar sound shattered the peaceful silence between us. The screen displayed another unknown number, different from Adrian's. Neither of us touched it. A text message appeared by itself. The words were short enough that both of us could read them at the same time. We know you remember the notebook. Stop asking questions. Every drop of warmth disappeared from my body. My hands became cold around the coffee cup. Adrian looked at the message only once before calmly reaching for his own phone. He did not appear frightened. He appeared certain. They just made their first mistake, he said quietly. I looked up in confusion. What do you mean? He slipped his phone back into his jacket and stood. Until now, we only knew someone was watching you. He offered me his hand with steady confidence. Now they have confirmed exactly who they are looking for. I placed my hand in Adrian's without thinking. His grip was steady, firm enough to reassure me, but never controlling. Together we walked out of the coffee shop into the cool evening air, where the city continued moving as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yellow taxis flowed through the intersection. Steam drifted from a subway vent. Somewhere nearby, a saxophone echoed between the buildings. It amazed me that an entire world could continue uninterrupted while mine had completely changed in less than 3 days. The black SUV pulled quietly to the curb before we even reached the sidewalk. The driver opened the rear door with the same calm professionalism I had come to expect. Once we were inside, Adrian looked at the message on my phone one final time before handing it back to me. "Do not reply," he said. "Do not block the number either. Can they really be found from one message?" I asked. "Sometimes." He looked out the window as the vehicle merged into traffic. "Sometimes people reveal far more than they intend." We drove for nearly 20 minutes before stopping in front of a quiet brick building overlooking the East River. It was not a towering mansion or a heavily guarded fortress like I had imagined someone of Adrian's influence would own. Instead, it looked elegant without trying to impress anyone. Warm lights glowed through large windows, and autumn flowers lined the entrance. As we stepped inside, I noticed framed photographs along one hallway. Children holding books, community kitchens, scholarship ceremonies, hospital fundraisers. Adrian appeared in only a few of the pictures, always standing toward the back rather than in the center. I slowed my pace, surprised once again by how different reality felt from rumor. "This is where you live?" I asked. "Part of the time," he answered. "The rest of the time, I seem to live inside meetings." I laughed quietly before realizing it was the first genuine laugh I had shared with him. It felt strangely natural. A woman in her 60s entered from another room, carrying a tray with 2 cups of tea. "Good evening, Adrian," she said warmly before smiling at me. "And you must be Emily." My surprise must have been obvious because she chuckled softly. "He does not usually bring guests." Adrian accepted the tea with an expression I had never seen before. Relaxed, almost like a son returning home. "Thank you, Maria." She gently touched his shoulder before leaving us alone. "She has worked with my family since I was a child," Adrian explained. "She still reminds me to eat lunch." I smiled. Someone should. We sat near a fireplace while the rain began falling again outside the tall windows. The quiet crackle of burning wood filled the room. For the first time since I had met him, I no longer felt afraid of being in his presence. The fear had been replaced by something unexpected. Trust. Not complete trust. Not yet. But enough to believe that every decision he had made since that rainy night had been intended to protect rather than control me. My phone buzzed once more. This time it was Sarah asking if I would be home soon. I replied that I was safe and would explain everything tomorrow. Adrian waited until I finished before speaking. "Your routine will return to normal." I looked at him. "After everything that happened?" He nodded. "Fear only wins if it convinces you to stop living your life. And if they come back?" His answer came without hesitation. "Then they will discover you are no longer alone." The simplicity of those words carried more comfort than any promise I had ever heard. The following morning, Adrian insisted on driving me to the bookstore himself. As the SUV stopped across the street, I looked through the windshield at the familiar brick building where my ordinary life had existed only days earlier. I turned toward him. "I never thanked you properly." He shook his head. "You already did. When you decided not to let fear change who you are." I stepped out of the SUV and took a few steps toward the bookstore before stopping. The same sidewalk, the same intersection, the same place where I had once believed I was completely alone. I turned back. Adrian was still standing beside the open door, watching to make sure I reached the entrance safely. Our eyes met across the morning crowd. This time I did not see the mysterious man inside the black SUV. I saw someone who had quietly carried the weight of an old promise for years and chose to keep it for a stranger without expecting anything in return. I smiled, and for the first time since that frightening night, I walked forward without looking over my shoulder. Sometimes people think strength is measured by how much power someone holds. I learned something different. Real strength is becoming the reason another person no longer has to be afraid. And if you ever find yourself wondering whether kindness still exists in a world that often feels too loud and too cold, remember this. The safest place I found in the entire city was not behind locked doors or bright streetlights. It was beside the man everyone else was afraid to approach, because sometimes the strongest protection arrives with quiet footsteps, a calm voice, and a simple promise that someone will never have to face the darkness alone again.